My name is Aaron Sloan. I am 30 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I sat at my parents' dining room table in Decatur, Illinois, and watched my family hand my brother a pocket watch that has been passed down in our family for 3 generations, while everyone around that table said his name like it belonged on a plaque somewhere. The watch belonged to my grandfather, Walter Sloan, who opened Sloan's Diner on El Dorado Street in 1970 with a $5,000 loan and a recipe for biscuits and gravy that hasn't changed since. The watch had gone to my father when Grandpa passed, and my father had always said it would go to whoever carried the diner forward. For 30 years, that had been an abstract idea. That Tuesday night, it became very concrete. My mother stood up holding a small velvet box. My father cleared his throat the way he does before he says something he's been rehearsing, and my brother Brett sat there in his work polo with the Sloan's Diner logo on the chest, looking like a man who had genuinely earned what was coming.
I just want everyone to know that if it wasn't for Brett walking into that credit union and fighting for this place, we'd be closing the doors on El Dorado Street for good. This watch should be his.
My father said that holding the velvet box toward Brett, his voice thick in the way it gets when he's trying not to cry in front of his kids. Brett stood up, took the box, and opened it like he was opening a gift he hadn't expected, even though everyone in that room had clearly planned this for days. My mother dabbed her eyes with a napkin and looked at Brett with the specific pride she reserves for moments she considers historic.
Your grandfather would be so proud of you, Brett. You saved this family's legacy. We're so proud of you.
I sat there with my wine glass in my hand, and I smiled, because that's what you do. I smiled and I said congratulations, and I meant it in the sense that I was genuinely glad the diner wasn't closing. What I did not say, what I had not said to anyone in 6 years, was that the reason the credit union didn't foreclose on Sloan's Diner that month had almost nothing to do with anything Brett did in that meeting. It had to do with a phone call I received 9 days earlier from a loan officer named Diane Marsh, who has known our family for 22 years, and who called me first because my name has been on that loan since I was 24 years old. Before I tell you what happened with that phone call, and what happened 3 weeks later when my mother opened an old photo box looking for pictures for the diner's anniversary display, please subscribe and drop your city and your local time in the comments below. I read everyone. Now, let me take you back, because you need to understand the diner, and you need to understand my family before any of the rest of this makes sense. Sloan's Diner has been on the corner of El Dorado Street and 4th in Decatur, Illinois since 1970. My grandfather Walter Sloan built it from the ground up. Not literally, the building was already there, an old hardware store he gutted and converted, but everything inside it, the counter, the booths, the menu, the specific way the kitchen runs, all of that was his. He ran it for 32 years. My father, Tom Sloan, grew up in that diner the way some kids grow up in a backyard. He started bussing tables at 12, learned the grill at 16, and took over full operations when my grandfather's hips finally gave out in the early 2000s. By the time I was born, Sloan's Diner was simply a fact of our family's life, the way some families have a lake house or cabin. Ours was a building with a neon sign that said EAT, and a regular crowd that had been eating breakfast there for 3 generations. My father is not a man who talks about feelings directly. He talks about the diner instead, and if you listen carefully, the diner conversation is usually the feelings conversation, wearing a disguise. When my father is proud of someone, he talks about the diner doing well. When my father is worried, he talks about the diner needing work. The diner is the language. Everything else gets translated through it. My mother, Carol, worked the front of house for 26 years before her knees made standing for 10-hour shifts impossible. She knows every regular's order, every regular's grandkids' names, and every regular's medical history in more detail than most of their doctors. She is warm in the specific, practiced way of someone who has spent decades making strangers feel like family, and she applies that same warmth to her actual family, which sometimes means the warmth gets distributed according to who's standing in front of her rather than who actually needs it. I am the older of 2 kids. My brother Brett is 3 years younger than me. I left Decatur for Chicago after college, where I took a job in commercial lending at a regional bank. I've been there 6 years, and I am now vice president. which is a title that means very little to most people and means almost nothing at all. At a Sloan family dinner, where the only currency that has ever really mattered is whether you're standing behind that counter on a Tuesday morning. Brett stayed. He started working the diner full-time right out of high school, worked his way through every station, and has been the de facto general manager since my father's heart attack 6 years ago. He is good at it. I want to say that clearly because nothing in this story is about Brett being incompetent. He runs that diner well. He knows the suppliers. He knows the staff. He knows how to keep a 40-year-old building from falling apart one repair at a time. What Brett does not know, what nobody in my family fully knew until 3 weeks ago, is the actual shape of what kept that diner alive 6 years ago and what kept it alive again 9 days before that dinner.
I used to think being the one who left meant I gave something up. It took me a long time to understand that leaving was also how I ended up being the only one with the tools to fix what was actually broken.
I said that to my friend Priya in Chicago about 2 weeks after the dinner. With the watch, sitting in her kitchen with a glass of wine I hadn't touched much. She nodded slowly, the way she does when she's letting something settle before she responds, and asked me to start from the beginning. So that's what I'm going to do here too. I need to tell you about the version of me that existed in Decatur before Chicago, because that version is the one my family still mostly sees when they look at me, and that's part of why none of this unfolded the way it should have. I was a good student, not dramatically so, not the kind of good student who wins regional competitions and gets written up in the local paper. Just steadily, reliably good in a way that nobody in my family ever had to think about. Brett was different. Brett struggled in school in the specific way that smart kids struggle when the structure of school doesn't match how their brain works. He got in trouble more, needed more meetings with teachers, needed more of my parents' attention in the form of phone calls and parent-teacher conferences and worry. I am not saying this to suggest Brett was a problem child or that my parents loved him more. I'm saying that in a busy family running a small business, attention flows toward whoever needs managing, and Brett needed managing in ways that were visible and immediate. I needed managing too, just in ways that were quiet and didn't generate phone calls. There's a specific memory I keep coming back to. I was 17 and I had just found out I'd gotten into the University of Illinois with a partial academic scholarship. Not full ride, but enough that it changed the math significantly for my parents, who'd been quietly stressed about how to pay for college for 2 kids on diner income. I came home from school with the acceptance letter and found the house in its usual after-school chaos. Brett was at the kitchen table with my mom, going over a missed assignment situation with his guidance counselor on speakerphone, and the whole kitchen had the particular tension of a crisis management session in progress. I put my acceptance letter on the counter, quietly, and went up to my room. Nobody noticed it until that evening when my dad came up after closing the diner, picked it up off the counter where I'd left it, and read it standing in the kitchen doorway.
Aaron, this is a partial scholarship to U of I. Why didn't you tell us about this the second you got home?
He said it from my bedroom doorway, holding the letter, and he sounded genuinely happy, which is part of why I remember it so clearly. My dad's happiness for me has never been in question. The timing of it has just always been a step behind whatever else was happening in the house.
I did tell you. I put it on the counter. Brett had stuff going on with school, so I figured I'd just let you see it when things settled down.
I said that without any real edge to it, because at 17, I genuinely believed that was just how things worked, that my good news was the kind that could wait and Brett's crises were the kind that couldn't. My dad sat on the edge of my bed for a minute, looked at the letter again, and didn't say anything else about the timing. He just said congratulations, and he meant it completely. That's the thing about my dad. He has never once failed to be proud of me. He has just, over and over, been proud of me a beat later than the moment called for it. I went to U of I, then to Chicago for the bank job, and I built a life there that nobody in my family has ever really seen up close. They know I have a good job. They know I make good money. They have never once asked me what I actually do all day, and for a long time I didn't think that mattered, because the diner was the thing that mattered, and I wasn't part of the diner anymore. That changed 6 years ago on a Thursday afternoon in March, when my mother called me at work sounding like a different person than I had ever heard her be. My dad had a heart attack on a Thursday morning while doing inventory in the diner's walk-in cooler. one of the line cooks found him on the floor and called 911. By the time my mother called me, he was already in surgery at Decatur Memorial, and the surgeon had told her it was a triple bypass and that the next 24 hours mattered. I drove down from Chicago that same afternoon, 3 hours on I-55 with my hands shaking on the wheel for most of it. I got to the hospital around 6 that evening. My dad was out of surgery and stable but sedated, and my mom was in the waiting room with Brett, both of them looking like they hadn't slept in days, even though it had only been hours. What I didn't fully understand until the following week was that my dad's heart attack had landed on top of a financial situation at the diner that had already been fragile for about a year. The diner had taken on debt during a kitchen renovation 2 years prior, new equipment, updated electrical, a walk-in cooler replacement, the works financed through a business loan with First Prairie Credit Union. The payments were manageable as long as the diner's revenue stayed steady. But the year before my dad's heart attack, a new chain restaurant had opened 2 miles away and pulled away a meaningful chunk of the breakfast crowd, and revenue had dropped enough that the diner had started missing payments. My dad hadn't told anyone how bad it had gotten. Not my mom, not Brett. He'd been quietly juggling it himself, the way he juggles everything, by not talking about it and hoping it would resolve itself before anyone had to know. The heart attack happened in the middle of that juggling act, and it landed everything at once, medical bills starting to come in. The diner closed for 4 days while my dad was in the hospital, which meant zero revenue during a stretch when First Prairie was already sending letters about the missed loan payments. I found out about all of it because the mail was piling up at my parents' house, and my mom asked me to go through it while she stayed at the hospital because she couldn't focus on bills right now, and Brett was covering shifts at the diner around the clock to keep it open with a skeleton crew. I sat at my parents' kitchen table that night with a stack of envelopes from First Prairie Credit Union, and I read through 18 months of statements and 2 formal notices, the second of which was a default warning with a 30-day cure period that had 19 days left on it.
Mom, I need you to look at something with me when you have a minute. It's not urgent for tonight, but it's going to be urgent soon. And I think Dad's been carrying this alone for a while.
I said that to my mom the next morning at the hospital while my dad was sleeping and Brett had gone to grab coffee. I kept my voice low and even because I'd learned in commercial lending that panic in your voice makes people stop hearing the actual words. My mom looked at the folder I'd brought, and her face did something I had genuinely never seen it do before. It went from exhausted to frightened in about 3 seconds, and then it went still, the way people go still when they're trying to hold 2 crises at once and can only fully look at one.
Aaron, I don't understand any of this. Your father has always handled the diner's finances. I don't even know who to call.
She said it quietly, almost embarrassed, and I understood in that moment that my mother had spent 30 years being completely competent at running the front of a restaurant and completely uninvolved in the financial structure underneath it, because that had been my dad's domain the way the kitchen had been hers, and now my dad was unconscious in a hospital bed and the domain had nobody standing in it. I told her I'd call First Prairie. I told her I'd handle it. What I didn't tell her, because I didn't fully understand it myself yet, was how much handling it was actually going to require. I called First Prairie Credit Union from the hospital cafeteria the next morning. I'd worked in commercial lending for 2 years by that point, which meant I knew exactly what a default notice meant and exactly how short 19 days actually was when a business has no cash flow and an owner in intensive care. The loan officer who picked up was a woman named Diane Marsh. She'd been the Sloan family's loan officer for longer than I'd been alive in any professional capacity. She'd handled my grandfather's original loan in the 70s as a junior staffer, and she'd handled every piece of the diner's financing since. When I told her who I was and why I was calling, her voice changed in a way that told me she already knew more about the situation than I did.
I've been trying to reach your father for 2 weeks, Aaron. I know about the heart attack. Word travels fast in this town. I was actually about to send the file to our workout department, which is the polite way of saying the foreclosure process. I'm glad you called before that happened.
She said it directly, but not unkindly. The voice of someone who had clearly been hoping for exactly this call and hadn't known how to make it happen from her side. She explained the situation in plain terms. The loan was 19 days from formal default. Default would trigger a much higher interest rate and immediate full balance due, and full balance due on a diner with 4 days of zero revenue and a hospitalized owner was not a situation that resolved itself. I asked her what our options were. She said the credit union could restructure the loan, extend the term, lower the payments, roll the missed payments into the new balance, but that any restructure required a qualified borrower to co-sign. Because my dad's current financial picture, on paper, with the medical bills now layering on top of the existing debt, didn't qualify on his own anymore. I asked what qualified meant in practical terms. She told me a credit score above 700, verifiable income, and no existing high balance debt that would push the household's overall risk profile too high. I sat in that cafeteria with a cold cup of coffee and did math I had never expected to do. My credit score was 741. I had 2 years of verifiable income at a real salary. I had no debt beyond a car payment and the remainder of my student loans, both of which were small relative to my income. I qualified.
Diane, if I co-signed on the restructure, what would that actually look like for me? I want to understand exactly what I'd be agreeing to before I say anything to my parents.
I asked her that carefully because I understood even in that moment, even exhausted and scared in a hospital cafeteria, that this was not a small decision and that I needed to understand it completely before I let it become a decision at all. Diane walked me through it in detail. I would be added to the note as a co-borrower, which meant I'd be legally responsible for the debt alongside my dad. My name would be on file with the credit union for the life of the loan, and if the diner ever defaulted again, the credit union's first call by the terms of the note itself would be to whichever borrower had the stronger qualifying profile on file, which, going forward, would be me. I want to be honest about what I was thinking in that moment, because it matters for everything that came after. I was not thinking about credit for saving anything. I was thinking about my dad waking up from surgery to find out his diner, his father's diner, was gone. I was thinking about 19 days. I told Diane yes, and I told her I'd come in that afternoon to sign whatever needed signing. I signed the restructure documents at First Prairie's branch on Pershing Road that Friday afternoon, 3 days after my dad's heart attack. My dad was still in the hospital, still recovering, still didn't know any of this had happened. Diane handled the signing herself, walked me through every page, and at the end, she did something I didn't expect. She asked if she could take a photo for the branch file, since the restructure was significant enough that her manager liked documentation of who'd been involved. I said sure. She took a photo of me at the conference table with the signed documents in front of me, and then, almost as an afterthought, she asked if my dad would want a copy for his records once he was well enough. Since the original note had been his father's loan, and this felt, in her words, like a meaningful moment for the family's history with the credit union. I didn't think much of it at the time. I told her sure, send a copy whenever, and I drove back to the hospital. My dad woke up fully 2 days later. I told him about the restructure on the 3rd day, when he was strong enough for a real conversation and the nurses had stepped out. I kept it simple. I told him the diner had fallen behind, that I'd talked to Diane, that we'd restructured the loan so the payments were manageable again, and that everything was handled. My dad was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question I'd been bracing for.
Aaron, what do you mean by we restructured it? What did you have to do to make that happen?
He asked it slowly, in the careful voice of a man who already suspects the answer and is steeling himself for it. I told him the truth, that the restructure required a qualifying co-borrower, that his current financials with the medical bills didn't qualify on their own, and that I'd added my name to the note alongside his. My dad closed his eyes. For a moment, I thought he was upset, and I started to explain that it was fine, that it was just a formality, that nothing about it changed who actually ran the diner. He opened his eyes and looked at me, and what was on his face wasn't upset. It was something closer to grief, mixed with relief. 2 things sitting on top of each other that don't usually belong together.
You shouldn't have had to do that. That's not a daughter's job. That's a father's job. And I let it get so bad that you had to fix it from a hospital cafeteria while I was unconscious.
He said it quietly, and his eyes were wet, and I held his hand and told him it was fine, that it was done, and that the only thing that mattered now was him getting better. What I didn't say because I didn't think it needed saying, was anything about whether anyone else in the family should know the details. My dad asked, a little later, in a smaller voice, if we could keep the specifics between the two of us for now, not because it was a secret, he said, just because he didn't have the energy to explain it to Carol and Brett on top of everything else, and he didn't want it to become a thing right now. I said okay. It seemed like such a small request at the time. I had no idea it would still be the operative arrangement 6 years later. The diner stabilized. My dad recovered slower than he wanted, faster than the doctors expected, which is about right for him. Brett kept the diner running through the worst of it, and once my dad was back on his feet, settled into the role he's had ever since, the person who's there every day, who knows the staff, who handles the day-to-day in a way that genuinely keeps the place alive. For 6 years, the loan sat quietly in the background of all of our lives. The payments were manageable. Nobody at First Prairie called. My name was on a document and a file in a branch on Pershing Road. And as far as I knew, the only two people who were fully aware of what that document said were my dad and me. I came home for holidays. I called my mom on Sundays. The diner came up in conversation the way it always had, Brett mentioning a new menu item, my mom mentioning a regular who'd passed away, my dad occasionally grumbling about the cost of eggs. Nobody mentioned the loan because, as far as everyone except my dad and I knew, there was nothing about the loan worth mentioning. I built my life in Chicago. I got promoted twice. I moved to a better apartment. I started dating someone seriously for the first time in years. My life there had nothing to do with Decatur, and Decatur, as far as it knew, had nothing to do with me beyond the usual the daughter who left, who calls on Sundays, who comes home for Thanksgiving.
Sometimes I'd be in a meeting in Chicago, reviewing a commercial loan file for some business I'd never set foot in, and I think about the fact that I had a loan file too, 3 hours south, with my name on it, that nobody at that table would ever know about.
I told my therapist that once, a few years into all of it, and she asked if it bothered me. I said no, honestly. It felt private in a way that didn't feel like a burden. It felt like something I'd done, quietly, that was mine. What I didn't fully think through, what I genuinely never considered in 6 years, was what would happen if the diner ever got into trouble again. Because if it did, the note's terms were clear about who the credit union would call first. And 6 years is a long time for a small business with thin margins to stay perfectly steady. It didn't stay perfectly steady. Last year, the cost of everything went up. Eggs, flour, oil, paper goods, the part-time wages Brett had to raise to keep staff from leaving for the new chain restaurant down the road. The diner's margins, which had been thin but stable for years, started to compress. By this spring, the diner had missed 2 payments to First Prairie, and a third one was coming due. And 9 days before that dinner with the watch, my phone rang during a Tuesday afternoon meeting in Chicago, and the caller ID said a Decatur area code I hadn't seen in 6 years. I stepped out of the meeting to take the call because something about a Decatur number after 6 years of silence felt like it couldn't wait. It was Diane Marsh.
Aaron, it's Diane Marsh over at First Prairie. I'm sorry to call you out of nowhere like this, but your name is still on the Sloan's Diner note from 6 years ago, and per our file protocol, you're the primary contact for any account issues going forward. We've got a situation I need to walk you through.
She said it kindly but directly, the way she talked to me in that cafeteria 6 years earlier, and I felt my stomach drop in a very specific, very familiar way. I stepped into an empty conference room and asked her to walk me through it. The situation was this. The diner had missed 2 payments, was about to miss a third, and per the original restructure terms, the ones I'd signed 6 years ago, 3 missed payments triggered a formal review that could lead to acceleration, meaning the full remaining balance becoming due immediately. Diane said she'd noticed the missed payments 2 months earlier and had been hoping someone from the family would reach out before it became a formal issue, but nobody had. I asked if anyone else had contacted the credit union about it. Diane said Brett had come into the branch the week before, asking general questions about the diner's account, but that because Brett wasn't on the note, because his name had never been added to anything, she hadn't been able to discuss the specifics of the loan with him under the privacy rules that govern who's authorized to receive account information.
I told him he'd need to have whoever's actually on the loan reach out, and I gave him my card. I assumed that meant your dad would call. I didn't realize, until I pulled the file just now, that it would mean you.
She said it carefully, and I could hear in her voice that she was starting to understand, in real time, the shape of something that had been sitting quietly for 6 years without anyone fully connecting the dots. I told her I'd call her back within the hour, and I sat in that empty conference room in Chicago and called my brother.
Aaron, hey, actually, this is kind of a weird time. I'm in the middle of something at the diner. What's up?
Brett picked up, sounding distracted, the way he always sounds when he's mid-shift, and I could hear the diner's ambient noise behind him, the clatter of the kitchen. Someone calling out an order. I told him I'd just gotten a call from Diane Marsh at First Prairie about the diner's loan, and that I needed to talk to him about something I should have told him a long time ago. There was a pause on the line, the specific pause of someone recalibrating, and then Brett said slowly that he'd gone into First Prairie the week before because Dad had finally told him the diner was behind on payments and he'd been trying to figure out who to talk to. I told him everything: the heart attack, the cafeteria, the co-signature, 6 years of my name being on that loan without him knowing. I told him as plainly as I could, because I'd learned a long time ago that complicated explanations make people suspicious and simple ones make people trust you. And I needed Brett to trust me in that moment more than I needed him to feel comfortable. Brett was quiet for a long time, long enough that I asked if he was still there.
I'm here. I'm just 6 years, Aaron. 6 years, and nobody told me. I've been running that place every single day thinking I knew everything about it, and the whole time, there was this thing underneath it that I didn't even know existed.
He said it without anger, exactly more like someone discovering that a room they'd lived in for years had a door they'd never noticed. I told him I understood, and I told him that wasn't on him, that it was a decision Dad and I had made together 6 years ago and never revisited, and that the only thing that mattered right now was fixing the actual problem before First Prairie's review deadline. What happened over the following 9 days is the part that ended up at the center of everything, because it's the part nobody else in my family saw, and it's the part that determined what would and wouldn't get said at that dinner 3 weeks later. I called Diane back that afternoon and told her I wanted to handle the restructure conversation myself, the way I had 6 years before, because I understood the terms and I understood what the credit union would and wouldn't be flexible on. Over the next week, I worked through it the way I'd work through any commercial loan modification, pulling the diner's recent financials from Brett, who sent me everything without hesitation once he understood what was happening, building a revised cash flow projection that accounted for the higher costs, and putting together a modification proposal that extended the loan's term again and adjusted the payment schedule to match what the diner could actually sustain. I sent the proposal to Diane on a Thursday. She reviewed it, made one adjustment to the interest calculation, and told me it looked solid. She just needed someone to come into the branch to formally execute the modification documents in person, since that was First Prairie's policy for any second restructure on a note. I couldn't drive down on a weekday without taking time off. I didn't want to explain to my Chicago team yet. So I told Brett everything was ready, that the modification was approved in principle, and that all that was left was for someone to go sign the paperwork in person at the branch.
I can go in tomorrow morning before the breakfast rush. Diane already knows me from last week. I'll just tell her I'm there for the paperwork.
Brett said that easily, glad to have something concrete to do, and I told him that sounded perfect. What I didn't tell him, what didn't occur to me to tell him, in the relief of having solved the actual problem, was that I should call Diane first and explain that Brett would be the one physically walking in, even though the modification itself existed because of a conversation she and I had had over the phone. I didn't make that call. Brett went in Friday morning, met with Diane, and signed the modification documents that existed because I'd built the proposal, but that he was the one physically present to execute, because the credit union's process required someone in the building and I was 3 hours away. Diane, doing her job exactly as she should, walked Brett through the modification terms in person, the same way she'd walked me through the restructure terms 6 years earlier, from where Brett was sitting in that branch on that Friday morning. What he experienced was The diner was in trouble. He went to the credit union, and a loan officer sat down with him and worked out a deal that saved the business. Every part of that was true from where he was standing. He had no way of knowing the deal had been built 3 hours away, over 5 days, by someone whose name had been quietly attached to that loan since before he'd ever had a reason to think about it. He called me that afternoon, genuinely thrilled, genuinely relieved, and told me it was done. The diner was safe, the payments were manageable, everything was fine. I told him that was great. I told him good job. I meant it because he had, in fact, walked into that branch and signed documents that saved the family's business, and the fact that the documents existed because of work I'd done didn't make his part of it untrue. What I didn't anticipate, what genuinely did not occur to me until I was sitting at that dinner table 9 days later, was that Brett would tell our parents the story exactly the way he'd experienced it, because why wouldn't he? As far as he knew, it was the whole story. The dinner was the following Tuesday. My mom called me that Sunday the way she always does and mentioned almost in passing, the way she mentions most things, that Brett had some good news about the diner and that she wanted to do a family dinner to celebrate, and could I come down? I drove down Tuesday afternoon. I want to be honest about my state of mind on that drive because it matters. I was relieved the situation was resolved. I was glad for Brett, genuinely. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in a place I hadn't fully examined, I think I assumed that at some point during the evening, the full picture would come out naturally, that Brett would mention calling me, or that Diane's name would come up and someone would ask how Brett had even gotten an appointment with her on short notice, and the threads would connect themselves. That is not what happened. What happened was the watch. I've already told you about the watch. My dad's toast, my mother's tears, Brett standing up and opening the velvet box like it was Christmas morning. What I haven't told you is what it felt like to sit there, 3 feet away from my own parents, while they constructed an entire narrative of rescue and legacy and pride, built on a version of events that was incomplete in a way only I could see.
Erin, isn't this wonderful? Your father and I have been so worried about that place. And Brett just took care of it. He's always been the one who shows up for that diner.
My mother said that to me directly, leaning over while Brett was still examining the watch, her face lit up with the specific happiness of a mother whose child has done something she can brag about. She squeezed my hand when she said it, including me in the warmth of the moment, clearly expecting me to share in it without reservation. I told her it was wonderful. I told her I was so glad. And I sat there for the rest of that dinner, eating pot roast at the table where I'd grown up, watching my brother turn my grandfather's watch over in his hands, and I said nothing about the 9 days before, or the 6 years before that, or the document with my name on it sitting in a file 3 miles away at the branch on Pershing Road. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think this is the part of the story that's actually the hardest. Harder than anything that came after. Have you ever sat in a room while people you love constructed a true story that left out the one piece that would have changed everything, not because anyone was lying, but because nobody knew to ask the question that would have surfaced it? If you've ever been in that kind of silence, the kind where speaking up would mean making the moment about you, so you just let it pass. Type the word silence in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, please do that now, because the part of this story that actually broke that silence wasn't anything I did. It was my mother, 3 weeks later, going through a cardboard box in the garage. The diner's 56th anniversary was coming up in the fall. My mother had decided, with the kind of energy she brings to anything involving the diner's history, that she wanted to put together a photo display for the dining room, decades of pictures of the diner, the family, the regulars. All of it, mounted on a big corkboard near the front register where customers could look through 56 years of Sloan's Diner while they waited for their food. She'd been collecting boxes of old photos from the house and from the diner's back office for weeks, sorting through them in the evenings. She called me on a Wednesday night, about 3 weeks after the dinner with the watch, and her voice had a quality I didn't recognize at first. Not upset exactly, but careful, the way you sound when you're holding something and you're not yet sure what to do with it.
Erin, I found something in one of the photo boxes from the diner's office, and I need you to explain something to me because I don't understand what I'm looking at, and your father's not answering when I ask him.
She said it slowly, and I felt something in my chest go very still, because I had a sudden, specific memory of a conference room on Pershing Road and a loan officer asking if she could take a photo for the branch file and saying she'd send the copy home for the family's records once my dad was well enough. I asked her what she'd found. She described it, a manila envelope from First Prairie Credit Union tucked into a box of diner photos containing a single photograph. 3 people at a conference table, me, my dad, and a woman my mom didn't immediately recognize with papers spread out in front of them, everyone looking at the camera. And on the back of the photo, in my dad's handwriting, a note.
It says, "The day Aaron saved Sloane's..." Carol, keep this somewhere safe. Aaron, what is this? What day? What does this mean?
She read it to me slowly, like she was reading it for the second or third time, trying to make the words mean something other than what they obviously meant. I sat down on my couch in Chicago and I told her everything. The heart attack, the cafeteria, the co-signature, 6 years of my name on that loan, the 9 days, 3 weeks ago, Brett going into the branch to sign documents I'd built from 3 hours away. My mother was quiet for a long time when I finished, long enough that I asked if she was okay.
Your father wrote this 6 years ago and never told me. And I sat at that table 3 weeks ago and told you how proud I was of Brett for saving this family's legacy, while you just sat there and let me say it.
Her voice wasn't angry, exactly. It was the voice of someone recalculating a math problem they'd been confident about for years, and discovering the answer had been wrong the entire time. I told her I hadn't meant to let her say anything. I told her it just never seemed like the right moment, and that I genuinely hadn't planned for any of it, not 6 years ago, and not 3 weeks ago either.
I know you didn't plan it, sweetheart. That's not what I'm upset about. I'm upset that your father has known this for 6 years, wrote it down so it wouldn't be forgotten, and somehow it still got forgotten anyway.
My mother called my father into the kitchen that same night while I was still on the phone and put him on speaker. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because I wasn't in the room, and I think my dad deserves the same care in this story that I've tried to give everyone else. My mom told him what she'd found: the envelope, the photo, the note on the back. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped.
I wrote that note the week I came home from the hospital. I meant to show your mother right away, and then there was so much going on with my recovery and the diner reopening, and I put it in a drawer to deal with later, and later never came. I'm sorry, Carol. I'm sorry, Aaron.
My dad's voice was rough, the way it gets when he's working hard not to fall apart. He explained, slowly, that he hadn't kept it a secret out of any plan. He genuinely just meant to tell my mother once things settled down, and then 6 years had gone by, the way 6 years do, one ordinary day folding into the next, and the thing he'd written down specifically so it wouldn't be forgotten had been forgotten by the very act of writing it down and setting it aside.
And then 3 weeks ago, when Brett told us what happened, I heard the diner saved, and I didn't think to ask how. I should have asked how. I think some part of me just didn't want to know if it was complicated again, because last time it was so complicated, and I didn't want to go through that fear again.
He said that quietly, and I understood it completely, in a way that made me ache for him a little. My dad had spent 6 years not wanting to look directly at the thing that had nearly destroyed his father's diner, and when it came back around, he'd reached for the simplest available story. Brett saved it because the simple story didn't require him to feel, again, how close it had come to ending. My mother asked him, gently, what he wanted to do now, and my dad said the thing that mattered most, the thing that told me he'd actually been carrying this more than any of us realized.
I want to talk to Brett. Not to take anything away from him. What he did on Friday was real, and I'm proud of him for it. But I want him to understand the whole picture. And I want to talk to Aaron about something I should have done 6 years ago and didn't.
The family conversation happened that weekend, back in Decatur at the kitchen table, not the dining room where the watch dinner had happened, but the kitchen, which in my family has always been where the real conversations occur. Just the 4 of us. My dad started. He told Brett everything, in the same plain order he'd told my mom the heart attack, the cafeteria, the co-signature, 6 years, the 9 days before the watch dinner. He didn't soften it, and he didn't dramatize it. He just laid it out the way he lays out a recipe, step by step, until the whole shape of it was visible. Brett listened without interrupting. When my dad finished, Brett looked at me for a long moment.
So, when I walked into that branch on Friday, and Diane sat down with me and explained the modification, that whole thing existed because you'd already built it. I wasn't saving the diner. I was just the one in the room.
He said it slowly, working through it, and I could see him doing the same thing I'd done in that empty conference room 9 days earlier, recalculating in real time what a moment had actually been versus what it had felt like from the inside.
Brett, you walked into that branch because Dad finally told you the truth about the missed payments, and you went looking for a solution instead of pretending it wasn't happening. That part was entirely you, and it mattered. The fact that the specific paperwork existed because of something from 6 years ago doesn't erase that.
I said that carefully because I meant it and because I was watching my brother's face do something I recognized, the same thing my own face had probably done at that watch dinner, the work of holding two true things at once that don't fit together. Comfortably. Brett was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I think is the most honest thing either of us said that whole weekend.
I think what actually bothers me isn't that you did this 6 years ago. It's that I've spent 6 years being the one everyone points to when they talk about who takes care of this place. And the whole time there was a version of taking care of it that I didn't even know was happening. That makes me feel like I don't actually know what taking care of it means anymore.
I told him I understood that completely because I'd spent 6 years on the other side of the exact same feeling, being the one who'd quietly done something significant, while everyone's understanding of who took care of the diner had a shape that didn't include me at all. We'd both been living inside an incomplete picture. We'd just been on opposite sides of it. My mother was the one who moved the conversation from understanding into action, which is very like her. She processes things, and then she organizes them.
I think it's time this family's understanding of who this diner belongs to actually matches reality. Aaron's name has been on that loan for 6 years. I don't think it should just be on a loan. I think it should be on the business.
She said it plainly, sitting at the kitchen table, with her hands folded, and I could tell she'd been thinking about it since the phone call 3 nights earlier, not as an emotional gesture, but as the kind of correction my mother makes when she discovers a ledger doesn't match the till. My dad nodded slowly. He said he'd actually thought about doing exactly this 6 years ago, after the restructure, and had never followed through, partly because it felt like a big formal step in the middle of his recovery, and partly, he admitted, because he'd worried it would feel strange to Brett, who was there every day and I wasn't.
But that's exactly the thing, isn't it? Brett's there every day, and that matters, and it always will. And Aaron's name has been carrying real legal weight for this place for 6 years, and that matters too. Those aren't competing facts. I don't know why I ever treated them like they were.
We talked through what it would actually look like. Sloan's Diner has operated as an LLC since my grandfather's later years, with my dad as the sole member. Over the following month, with an attorney my dad has used for decades, the LLC's operating agreement was amended to add me as a member alongside my dad, with a defined ownership percentage that reflected, in plain terms, the financial responsibility I'd been carrying since I was 24. Brett's role as general manager was formalized, too, with a management agreement that defined his compensation and his authority, something that, it turned out, had also never been written down anywhere. 6 years of trust operating on a handshake, the same way the loan had operated on a quiet phone call. None of this changed. Who showed up at the diner every morning? Brett is still there at 5 a.m. I am still in Chicago. But the paperwork now says what's actually true, for the first time in 6 years, and somehow that mattered more than I expected it to. The watch came up again about 6 weeks after all of this, on a Sunday when I'd driven down for the day. Brett and I were sitting in one of the diner's back booths after closing, going over the new management agreement together, and at some point he reached into his jacket and pulled out the velvet box.
I've been thinking about this thing for weeks. Grandpa's watch was supposed to go to whoever carries the diner forward. Dad said that like it was one person, but it's not, is it? It never really was.
He slid the box across the table toward me, not all the way, just far enough that it sat between us, equidistant, and I understood what he meant without him needing to spell it out further.
I don't want to take this from you, Brett. Dad gave it to you, and you've earned it every single day for 6 years in a way that has nothing to do with any loan.
I said that, and I meant it, and I pushed the box gently back toward him. Brett shook his head, and what he said next is the thing I think about most, out of everything that happened during those weeks.
Then let's not make it about one person owning it. Let's keep it at the diner, in the office, where Dad keeps the original loan paperwork from 1970. Both our names are part of this place's history now. The watch can just sit there and be part of that, instead of being a trophy for whoever gave the better toast.
We put the watch in the diner's office, in a small case my dad built for it, next to a framed copy of my grandfather's original 1970 loan agreement, the same $5,000 note that started all of this 56 years ago. And next to that, my dad added one more thing. The photograph from 6 years ago, the one my mother found in the box. Me, my dad, and Diane Marsh. Papers on the table, with his handwriting on the back. Finally, where everyone could see it. I drive down to Decatur more often now, not because anything dramatic changed in how often my family wants to see me. They always wanted to see me, but because something in how I think about that diner changed once the paperwork matched the truth. My mom and I talk about the diner differently now, too. Not just the warm, surface-level updates about regulars and menu items, but the actual operational stuff. The kind of conversation she used to only have with my dad, and that I now sometimes get pulled into as someone whose name is actually on the documents that govern the place. Brett and I talk more than we used to, which surprised me. Running a small business as co-members of an LLC, even an informal family one, gives you reasons to call each other that, "How's the diner going?" Never quite did. We've started having actual conversations about actual decisions, whether to update the point-of-sale system, whether to extend hours on weekends, the kind of conversations that require both of us, rather than the kind that happen and then get summarized at Thanksgiving. My dad told me something a few weeks ago on one of those Sunday visits, standing behind the counter while Brett closed up. He said he'd been thinking about why he wrote that note on the back of the photo 6 years ago in the first place. Why, in the middle of recovering from heart surgery with everything else he had to think about, he'd taken the time to write 4 sentences on the back of a photograph and tell Carol to keep it safe.
I think I knew, even then, that this was the kind of thing that gets forgotten if somebody doesn't write it down. I just didn't think it through far enough to realize that writing it down and actually telling someone aren't the same thing. The truth was sitting in a drawer the whole time. It just needed someone to open the drawer.
My mother was the one who opened the drawer. Not because she was looking for the truth specifically. She was looking for old photos of the diner for an anniversary display. The kind of ordinary, sentimental task that families do all the time without expecting anything to come of it. And 6 years of quiet, carefully unspoken history came out of a manila envelope because of it. My name is Erin Sloan. I am 30 years old. My name has been on the loan for Sloan's Diner since I was 24, and now it's on the business itself too, next to my father's, in a small office on El Dorado Street, where a pocket watch sits in a case beside a photograph my mother almost didn't find. The diner is still standing. Brett is still there every morning at 5. My dad still talks about feelings by talking about the diner, and I think, now, he's gotten a little better at noticing when the diner conversation and the feelings conversation are actually the same conversation, said out loud, finally, to the people who needed to hear it. It took 6 years and an old photo box for that to happen. But it happened. Before you go, I have one question for you. Has there ever been something true about you? Something real that you did that the people closest to you simply never had the full picture of, not because anyone lied, but because nobody ever asked the right question? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story meant something to you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you're here for the next story on this channel. I'll see you then.